there's been some speculation that the changing intellectual property rules and allowing the recipe for these vaccines to be shared, do you think that would be helpful?
No.
No one is safe until everyone is safe. This is the premise we've all been told is necessary to end this pandemic for good. And it's the end of 2021. Why is it that the vaccine distribution has been so unbelievably unequal? Current models predict the vaccination rates of middle-income countries won't reach herd immunity levels sooner than 2023. Poor countries won't reach those levels by 2024, if at all. This situation is way worse than bad. Low-income nations aren't just failing to inoculate their most vulnerable populations. High-income economies are actually administering booster doses at a faster rate than poor countries are administering their first doses. When rich countries have already 2/3 of their population fully vaccinated, in poor countries barely 3% of their populations received a second dose. Most of the low-income countries aren't hammered just by COVID-19. They're also battling with HIV, malaria, and even polio outbreaks. Many people there get infected with SARS-CoV-2 while recovering from other serious illnesses. 4 of the last 5 variants came out of the countries with low vaccination rates at the time of the outbreaks. This happened over a period of 13 months, and it won't get any better in the next 13 months either. The original promise was that the poor countries would receive enough doses to vaccinate 20% of their populations by the end of this year. That's a laughably low bar. But even that turned out to be an embarrassing failure, since this target won't be reached until the end of next year, with no plan on how the remaining 80% of the poor will get their vaccines afterwards. Vaccine nationalism is causing children in rich countries to be more likely to get a booster dose than vulnerable older folks in poor countries are to get their first dose. This isn't happening because rich democracies would vote for this. This is happening at the benefit of pharmaceutical manufacturers whose profits are booming unlike anything they've ever seen before. This is a big claim, I understand, but it's the most logical one. Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson stand to make $60 billion in revenue from vaccine deals this year alone, with dozens more secured in future deals with rich countries. All this revenue is almost exclusively coming from deals with the developed nations. Poor countries can't afford to buy vaccines at such higher prices, and they aren't manufacturing any vaccines of their own. Doses are being sold at $15 a pop, with plans to hike up the price to $37 for smaller volume contracts. Vaccine manufacturers argue they have a multi-tier system with pricing as low as $1.60 per dose for the low-income countries, subsidized by the taxpayer in the developed nations. But that still requires hundreds of millions of dollars poor countries don't have at their disposal. Developing countries are told to budget for their co-payments by securing loans that will indebt their governments, stifling their economies in the future. Other than that, they have no choice, no say. The decisions have already been made by someone else. But who? That's a good question. It's not up to the who. If it was, all academic, research, and private institutions would temporarily donate their technology and intellectual property to the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP for short. This pool was opened in March 2020 by the World Health Organization to guarantee easy and equitable access to the necessary tools for all countries with competent facilities to manufacture vaccines locally. The WHO feared that if left to private for-profit incentive, global supply chain issues would prevent quick distributions of the vaccines from a few centralized manufacturers to the rest of the world. And they were right. Global supply chain crumbled, and it hasn't got better almost 2 years into the pandemic. Oxford University welcomed CTAP, and they were willing to donate their technology to the pool with a royalty-free license. That would mean the world would have an open-source vaccine that would drastically impact the market and pricing of the competing offers. Most importantly, developing nations could start manufacturing immediately without settling exclusive bilateral deals or wait for donations. But then, someone stepped in and told Oxford to find a supplier to license its manufacturing to and keep all the patents closed. And that someone was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The university listened and found a manufacturer in Sweden. And that's how we got the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Why would Bill Gates prevent Oxford from opening up their vaccine? Because Bill Gates has a plan, and it only works if everyone abides by its rules, even if they don't want to be part of his plan. Single deviation would cause it to shatter into pieces. In April 2020, about a month after the WHO announced CTAP, Bill Gates launched his own initiative to distribute the vaccines. It's called the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or ACT Accelerator for short. It was designed to include development of all pharmaceutical technologies, from therapeutics to testing through private-public partnerships. In contrast to the WHO's proposed CTAP, ACT Accelerator would protect their exclusive intellectual property rights and patents. But with this setup, pharmaceutical companies would never sell their vaccines at a loss, just to make sure poor countries can afford them. Which is why Bill Gates also introduced COVAX, the biggest arm of ACT Accelerator, that would subsidize donations of vaccines to poor countries by selling them at a higher price to rich countries. Companies participating in COVAX would be able to set their own prices, they wouldn't be subject to any transparency requirements, and they would never have to face any legal repercussions for potential damages caused by their products. So by that measure, Bill Gates alone convinced developed governments that the best way to vaccinate the world is to make taxpayer in advanced economies pay for higher prices set by pharmaceutical companies, slowly donate the vaccines to developing nations, and give legal immunity to big pharma. If you go to the WHO website, you will see COVAX and ACT Accelerator housed under the agency's umbrella. But make no mistake, this is a top-to-bottom Bill Gates initiative, managed and staffed primarily by the Gates Foundation employees, and it failed to deliver on its most basic, offensively low promise of inoculating the priority fifth of low-income populations. This is the great Bill Gates scam. Rich countries get shafted on prices by big pharma, who get obscenely wealthy from taxpayers' money, while no one cares about 2/3 of the global population that's below the high-income threshold. Bill Gates says that his plan is the only way this can work, that open sourcing patents would lead to incompetent manufacturers failing to meet production standards.
People are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. Every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way.
But the WHO found competent and experienced teams in developing nations able to start producing mRNA vaccines immediately. These companies, alongside 140 countries who signed the pledge to temporarily waive vaccine patents, are still waiting for the right decision to be made. And yet, nothing changes. The WHO calls out this failure.
It makes no sense to give boosters to healthy adults or to vaccinate children when the health workers or older people and other high-risk groups around the world are still waiting for their first dose.
But I also don't admit Bill Gates' COVAX is to be blamed.
We have shown that COVAX works if it has the vaccines.
But why? Because over the last 2 decades, Bill Gates has consolidated too much power and influence on public health around the globe. Bill Gates has gained an incredible amount of control over the World Health Organization. But how could this happen? How can one billionaire gain so much power and influence? This is a United Nations body that advises on public health policies of 194 member states. This isn't a couple of senators in Congress that can be bought off with lobbying money. But let's see who is facing the WHO. Bill Gates has been the richest man in the world since Windows 95 and never left the top 4 position. Even when he gave up day-to-day management at Microsoft, he's earned so much wealth his passive multi-billion-dollar investments kept increasing his net worth ever since. With Windows becoming a global monopoly, Bill Gates triggered an infinite money glitch and never stopped. As of this writing, his net worth is $139 billion. On the other side is the WHO, desperately underfunded global agency that tries to tackle too many pressing issues at once. It does have a multi-billion-dollar budget, but it's only a few billion dollars biennially. In contrast, Bill Gates alone has donated over $35 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to date. The charity's total assets are north of $45 billion, and just in 2020, the foundation donated over $6 billion in grants. Not only is Bill Gates more powerful than the WHO, he is cartoonishly more powerful than the WHO. And unlike Bill Gates, the WHO doesn't generate any revenue. Its budget relies on mandatory and voluntary contributions. The mandatory dues are paid by member states, who are often reluctant to support the agency. For instance, when the WHO tried to raise the dues by 10%, the opposition to this proposal was so fierce, the hike was watered down to just 3%. With inflation at current rates, this is a budget cut, which is why less than a fifth of the WHO's budget actually comes from member state dues. The vast majority of the budget is covered by voluntary donations from rich countries, NGOs, and philanthropists, and now the Gates Foundation is continuously popping up as one of the largest donors of the WHO. So Bill Gates decided to support an underfunded public health agency whose main focus is to help the poor. What's wrong with that? Well, it's because none of the Gates donos come without strings attached. The Seattle billionaire wants to see tangible and marketable results. Diseases that give numbers, percentages, and trends. Malaria, AIDS, or polio became Gates' priorities, and so it meant they became the WHO's priorities. It's not because the WHO would let it be that way. The agency implemented a rule that private donations can only go to the WHO projects approved by the member state. Thus, billionaires can't just make up new programs out of thin air, but they still get to decide which WHO programs get their funding. It's quite strange that the WHO would not maintain the sovereignty over where the donated money goes. So let's look at AIDS, a high-profile killer in sub-Saharan Africa. Gates poured so much money into battling the disease, his grants created an artificial demand for high-skilled clinicians, diverting staff away from basic care. Severe staff shortages caused many AIDS survivors to be often neglected in later care, and them dying to more common illnesses such as birth sepsis, diarrhea, and asphyxia. The shortages affected availability and distribution of important nutrition, making many patients vomit their pills due to starvation. And you'd think that while tragic, these are still unintended consequences. But it's hard to believe Gates' intentions when programs funded by him specifically instructed caregivers to ignore patients' needs unrelated to the vaccination treatment. During the malaria crisis, many WHO scientists loudly criticized the foundation's influence for stifling diversity of views and making its own policy decisions. His monopolistic philanthropy created a chilling effect on scientific research. The Gates-funded scientists were often seen acting as a bloc, defending each other's research and opposing WHO's policy positions. Getting independent review was becoming increasingly more difficult. This was the case even when it came to suggesting drug protocols with insufficient research backing its safety. Private donations could easily introduce a conflict of interest when they could sway WHO's policies to benefit big pharmaceutical corporations or food retailers. This is why the WHO doesn't openly accept donations from these entities. But that's not the policy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In fact, with the main focus on building private-public partnerships, it is the exact opposite. The Gates Foundation is a non-profit, everyone knows that. But not many realize that it's actually two entities, not one. There is the foundation, which contributes grants and donations, but there is also the Foundation Trust, which is tasked with generating revenue for the foundation. The common misconception is that the foundation is primarily funded by Bill and Melinda, and while it's true they donated billions into the charity, that's not how the foundation gets most of its money. The vast majority comes from the Gates Foundation Trust, a nonprofit venture that invests into big corporations to generate revenue for the foundation. In the multi-billion-dollar portfolio, direct investments include Coca-Cola, Walmart, Walgreens Boots, Group Televisa, and Liberty Global. 1/4 of the trust's assets are invested in Berkshire Hathaway, that has further $17 billion invested in Coca-Cola and $29 billion invested in Kraft Heinz. The foundation and trust also build partnerships with big pharma companies, including Pfizer BioNTech. Many of the former big pharma executives are board members of the Gates Foundation. Through the same revolving door, the foundation installed its own executives into the boards of multiple nonprofits, influencing public health policies around the world. This is the Bill Gates hostile takeover of the World Health Organization. This is what made Bill Gates the world's most powerful doctor without stepping a foot in a medical school. Protecting vaccine monopolies is a failed strategy. The numbers clearly show it. But Bill Gates still believes his plan is ultimately better than waiving patents because it created a business model for manufacturers to work on the vaccines. But who actually paid for the vaccines? It's not one billionaire with his foundation. It is you. You paid for the vaccine platforms researched and developed by government-funded programs. Every manufacturer received billions of dollars to develop, test, and manufacture vaccines completely risk-free. You took the risk in case the research couldn't deliver an efficient vaccine. This is a statement of fact. Taxpayers donated exponentially more to vaccine development than Bill Gates did with his foundation. The Moderna vaccine was actually developed and invented by the scientists from the National Institute of Health in partnership with the company, and officially bears the name of both the agency and the firm. The NIH patents are actually foundational to a number of other vaccines, including the Pfizer version. Moderna received $10 billion from the government and worked with the NIH scientists for 5 years. Names of the scientists are actually listed on the patent that the agency shares with Moderna. But Moderna doesn't want to share the patent with the health agency because they want monopoly control over licensing of the vaccine to the rest of the world. Bill Gates did create a new business model for big pharmaceutical companies. A model based on predatory practices where a small selection of the biggest manufacturers become monopolies with enough power to defy governments and dictate global public health policies without any oversight. When Pfizer makes deals with countries, they pressure their governments into signing deals that put them in a great disadvantage. To get a vaccine deal with Pfizer, governments have to sign non-disclosure agreements, refuse to accept additional donations of the vaccine, take responsibility for intellectual property infringements, agree to resolve contract disputes through secret arbitrators outside of public courts, use sovereign assets as a collateral in case of disputes, including embassies and military bases, and surrender all decision-making power over vaccine delivery to Pfizer. If the pandemic isn't stopped, it could result in an endemic, a state where the virus circulates in pockets around the world with regular reoccurrence. Pfizer executives told their investors that the endemic would be a significant opportunity to hike up the prices of their vaccine. It would mean annual revaccination would become necessary and the demand for their vaccine would never stop. Governments would have to continue securing large volumes of their vaccine at continuously higher prices than the year before. A situation where not everyone is safe is precisely what guarantees big pharma bigger profits and higher shareholder value. It isn't just going to cause immeasurable human suffering, it is also what is going to lead to dire economic consequences for all of us. Even countries with sufficient vaccination rates are expected to impede their recovery and growth if their trading partners do not vaccinate enough of their own populations. Inequitable vaccine access could cost the global economy up to $9.2 trillion, half of which is going to be paid by rich countries. But Big Pharma will still make profit, and Bill Gates will still be a billionaire influencing public health policies of the entire globe.